Good evening. I am Ricardo Duque, and I am the co-chair of DUHLAA. DUHLAA is Duke University's Hispanic Latino Alumni Association, and I'm really excited to welcome you to tonight's Latinx Voices Climate Change Close-Up. We're going to have the opportunity to listen to some great Duke alumni and panelists who will be sharing their vision and their better understanding of our current situation for climate change. Before I go ahead and introduce them, I'd also like to thank Jennifer Moreno, our Vice Chair of Programming, who has been instrumental behind the scenes, organizing, bringing up this idea and putting together this event. Today, we will have three great panelists. And those panelists, we have first Dr. Luana Lima. She's Associate Director of Education Programs, Duke Energy Initiative. We also have Rafaela Moura. She is a Master in International Development Policy, class of 2012, and she's currently the Senior Advisor at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, known as EPA. And last but not least, Christina Martinez, class of 2016. She's an interpretive park ranger at Sequoia National Park. So let me first pass it on to Christina, who will be sharing her perspective. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you, Ricardo, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. So my name is Christina Martinez, and I am an interpretive park ranger with the National Park Service, an agency under the Department of the Interior. I have worked in different national parks, such as Glacier Bay National Park and Preserve in Alaska, currently in Sequoia National Park, which is located in Central California. And then next, I'll be heading to Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. So as an interpreter, my role is to help visitors that visit national parks to make connections to those places through education. For a person is more likely to care about an environmental issue or about a place if they find a personal connection to it. Obviously, climate change is clearly impacting national parks across the country in different ways. And thus, as an educator, I have the opportunity to talk about specific climate change impacts to a general audience. If you want to learn more about the agency's work in combating climate change, you can check out the National Park Service's Climate Change Response Program. And like I mentioned, I'm an interpreter. I am a frontline representative of the National Park Service. You may have seen park rangers when you visit national parks yourself. And really, we provide information to visitors when it comes to things that they can do, safety, and more essentially education about that place, especially considering how climate change is rapidly changing those places. Of course, my job does require me to stay updated in current research regarding climate change in national parks. And that way I have the most up-to-date information to give to visitors. I have the ability to make climate change personal to these people that visit. How are the places that they hope to keep visiting and bringing their children to being affected by climate change? My goal, of course, is not only to make visitors aware of how the landscape is being impacted by climate change, but also how people are also being impacted in different ways. I want visitors to not only care about how climate change is threatening the biggest trees on Earth, the giant sequoias, but also how it harms the California Central Valley's communities close to the park, with many of those communities being Indigenous, Asian, and especially Latino. So Sequoia National Park, over the years, I have been here for a good 2 years, not all at once, but throughout my career after I graduated in 2016. And so my experience is really talking about Sierra Nevada ecology and also living in a place that's experiencing rapid change. Parks like Sequoia and Yosemite National Park are located in the Sierra Nevada range, which encompasses a good portion of Central California. About 60% of California's water supply originates in these mountains. So changes to the snowpack has serious consequences. Currently, they have done a lot of snowpack surveys, and actually as of April 1st, the statewide snowpack is just at 59% of average this time of the year, as we continue to experience one of the driest years on record. And that is kind of concerning because that does bring an issue of water supply and access to the water supply that lives, a lot of it stored here in the Sierra Nevada snowpack. Even recently, the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture declared 50 of the 58 counties in California as drought disaster areas. And so obviously, as someone that talks about this park and how it's being impacted, I do get to unfortunately experience a lot of the consequences that come with the drought-stricken landscape. Obviously, one of the biggest challenges brought on by climate change to communities here in California, especially Central California, is that we have to deal with more frequent, intense, and larger wildfires. Years of drought, bark beetle infestations, human activity, weather events, and a history of forest mismanagement that actually came in the form of fire suppression have all contributed to these new types of wildfires that have been defining this landscape. Climate projections estimate that hotter and drier conditions will continue in the Sierra Nevada, and this will shape fire seasons to come. And the 3 summers that I have been here, I have not experienced a summer like that of last year as a result of wildfires. When I tell you that it was a hellscape, it was a literal hellscape for a good chunk of the summer. I'm sure you all heard in the news of the catastrophic wildfire season that we had here in California. Over 4.2 million acres burnt in the 2020 fire season, and it's actually considered the largest wildfire season that was recorded in California's modern wildfire management history. And so wildfires bring a lot of consequences. They bring displacement, loss of life and property, but also public health issues such as hazardous air quality. I want to use mitigating wildfire hazards as an example of how Latino communities can be disproportionately impacted, especially here in the Central Valley. So due to the geology of Central California, pollution from the Bay Area, like San Francisco and even Northern California, in addition to Southern California, all that pollution from different places in the state and even beyond make their way into the Central Valley where it gets trapped. Therefore, a lot of that wildfire smoke throughout the states ends up here in the Central Valley. In fact, Sequoia National Park, not counting wildfires as a factor, but this park has the worst air quality of any national park in the United States. So the air quality is already not the best. But when you add wildfire smoke traveling from different areas, it does get trapped here. And so what we experienced last summer was multiple days that were hazardous air quality conditions. Of course, there were people in the area that were escaping these conditions and going to other places that had slightly better air quality. But that does pose the question as who has the resources to move when such hazards are in place? It's most likely not going to be a lot of our Latino community here in the Central Valley and throughout the entire state of California. And if one cannot leave, how do you mitigate smoke inhalation symptoms? Air filters were being sold out in many stores throughout California as more people wanted to mitigate the consequences of wildfire smoke. I went on for weeks and weeks on end where I was feeling nauseous, my head was hurting because we've been working outside due to the pandemic. And so I was not feeling well for a good chunk of the summer. And so kind of also made me think about all the people that are working outdoors and are in much longer exposure doing a lot of hard labor. And I definitely think about farm workers, especially where we are here in the Central Valley. Between 1/3 to 1/2 of the country's farm workers are actually here in California, with a good chunk of them here being in the Central Valley. And then the overwhelming majority of those farm workers have ties to Mexico, even indigenous communities within Mexico. So clearly, wildfire does impact the Latino community if we just look at who is being impacted in the agricultural sector and who's actually out on the fields, just right here in the Central Valley. And so obviously, when it comes to being able to move, unlike others in a more privileged position, a lot of farm workers do not have the ability to move. They don't have the resources to be able to, stop working and gaining wages and go somewhere else where the air quality is a lot better. Another important component to consider in mitigating hazards is the communication of these hazards in a language people can understand. Sometimes there can be delays in evacuation warnings and orders, which actually we did see some delays, slight delays, but there were delays in translating, at least in Spanish, these evacuation warnings and orders. And obviously a delay in these hazard warnings can have serious impacts. As someone that speaks Spanish and is a bilingual speaker, my job is to also communicate hazards to the public whenever they visit a national park. And so I understand that communication is an extremely vital part of this whole equation of trying to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so, it is always really important to consider that this information, especially when it comes to wildfires in a state that is prone to wildfires, it's extremely important to share vital information in languages the Latino community speaks, and not just in Spanish. Another thing that also came up last year, we were having a lot of heat waves, and not only did we have to deal with hazardous air quality, but they did have to shut off the power grid. So a lot of people had to be careful of not using too much power. People didn't have access to cool off. And it also kind of poses that questions like, who is the most harmed when it comes to these increases in temperature? And so these are, that in itself kind of brings me the question of, the role of energy into all of this, which I hope Luana, which would be the next speaker, is going to tap into it. But overall, I do believe that if we look at just wildfires in California as a case study, we can see the many different ways and the cascading impacts that climate change is having on Latino communities. I can only really speak for what's really happening here in the Central Valley of California and what communities it's impacting here. And given because of our huge farm worker workforce, who's predominantly Latina, the different ways that they are being impacted, but also just my own personal story and the ways that I got impacted. I grew up in Wilmington, Los Angeles, and that is one of the areas where they have a lot of oil refineries. So because of where I grew up, because of environmental racism, I probably am more likely to feel more smoke inhalation symptoms. So it's something that is also part of the equation when it comes to who is more vulnerable to wildfire smoke when it comes to public health hazards. And so that is kind of what I have to share about my experience. But I do hope that if you have any questions, put them in the chat for me. And so with that, I want to pass on the mic to Luana. And thank you so much for joining into this conversation.
Thank you, Christina. That was a good perspective. And I'm so happy to be here today, join you all in this conversation. As Ricardo said, I'm the Associate Director for Educational Programs at the Duke University Energy Initiative. And I'm also a faculty member at the Nicholas School of the Environment. Most of my research and teaching focus explores the ongoing transformation of energy systems for climate change mitigation, but also how climate change impacts energy demand and energy supply systems. And that's what I want to talk to you today. I want to talk about and share my experience with the impacts of climate change on energy systems, the energy transformation, and what that means for our Latin community, but also Latin America as a whole. So I'm originally from Brazil, that's where I grew up. I've been living in the US for a few years. And what I want to share with you today is kind of my path and what brought me to where I am today. So we all know that climate change is driving the energy sector transformation. It's shifting electricity generation to renewables, and it's also electrifying heating and transportation systems. Climate change is a global problem, but the impacts of climate change, like Christina said, they affect each country and each community in a different way. So I want to start showing you a little bit about what's happening in Latin America. So Latin America actually accounts for less than 10% of global greenhouse gases emission, and yet the region is extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Why? Because a lot of our energy resource is already based on renewables. So I'll give you one example on the electricity. 45% of Latin American electricity comes from hydropower, and climate change poses increasing challenge to hydropower generation due to changes in precipitation pattern, increased temperatures, increased variability and probability of extreme precipitation events. A few years ago, the Brazilian regulatory agents assembled an interdisciplinary research group to evaluate the impact of climate change on hydropower in Brazil. I was part of that team. I was still living in Brazil back then. We looked at historical data for the hydropower plants. We looked at global climate model projections for climate variables such as precipitation, wind, solar radiation, temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure. And the goal was to estimate the impact on water inflow throughout the country. So Cam, if you could share the slide with them, I just want to illustrate some of our findings and kind of share with all of you the main findings of the research. So you can see here 3 plots, and each plot represents 30-year periods starting from 2011 and going all the way to the end of the 21st century. And I want to call your attention to the first image on the left, which is the first period from 2011 to 2041. You can see that we already have inflow anomalies ranging from -15 to 15%. So the green circles represent hydropower reservoirs with projected increase in future inflows with respect to the base period. Note that these hydro plants are located on the south of the country, and the red circles are spread over the north, central, and east part, indicating projected reduction in water inflows with respect to the base period. So the east of the country corresponds to our semi-arid region. So climate change will exacerbate even more the droughts on that area. And as for the south, the increased inflows are going to lead to more and more flood in the future. I'm sharing with you like projected values based on projected models, but the truth is this is already happening. I was there, I was experiencing all of these. And just by looking at historical data, we are able to see those trends. So climate change is already affecting our countries. But in terms of electricity generation, so let's go back to the hydropower part. One can think that, well, we have some places with increased inflows, we have some places with decreased inflows, so maybe on average electricity generation will remain the same. But the answer is no. We did that calculation. We transformed inflow into electricity, and we observed that in terms of the country's total electricity generation, if we keep our installed capacity the same, by 2041, our electricity generation from hydro is projected to decrease by at least 15%. For Latin America, lack of electricity from hydro means higher electricity prices, dispatching more thermal plants, so increasing our footprint, and sometimes even curtailing demand because we may not have enough power to supply our customers. So those results were so important for generation expansion planning purpose. But for me, it was more than that. It was one of those moments on your career where you're like, okay, I know what I want to do. Our hydropower is something that we Latin Americans are so proud of. And seeing the threat climate change is posing to our hydro system made me realize that I wanted to be part of the solution and I wanted to do something about it. So I spent the following years doing research on renewable generation, renewable energy integration, distributed energy resources, electricity rate structure, and then I came across another very important climate change challenge. I was already aware of how climate change affects countries differently, but then I started realizing that there are disparities even within a country. So what I want to talk a little bit with you guys about is the concept of a just energy transition. And for that, let's just go back to the US perspective. Kim, you can stop sharing your screen now. Thank you. So an important dimension of the energy transition is that without specific efforts to ensure an equitable transition, not everyone will benefit equally, not everyone will participate. And we cannot achieve a sustainable transition without justice, right? So most of the discussions about a just energy transition in the US tend to focus on employment losses in legacy industries, more specifically coal miners. But there is another aspect of a just transition that I would like to mention, which is energy insecurity. Climate change is enhancing energy security. And why? It is possible that energy transition will result in a higher cost of energy, at least in the short and medium term. So we know the electricity from renewables are free, but the problem is the investment needed to cover new infrastructure and technology costs. So for example, we are going to need to invest in more power lines, right? Renewable power plants are built where the resources are, and sometimes it means further away from consumers. Also, renewable sources are intermittent, so they need to be coupled with other technologies like battery storage. So you need more investment to make that happen as well. So the costs are likely going to rise, and it will disproportionately harm those that already pay a large share of their income on energy. So if you think about it, Latin families are more likely to live in energy inefficient units, in older buildings with bad insulation. Maybe they have older appliances which will require more energy to heat or cool to adequate living conditions. Also, access to low carbon and efficient technologies is not universal. They have high upfront costs, and sometimes they are only available for higher income households. Think about electric vehicles, residential solar panels, smart meters, efficient appliances, or something as simple as LED light bulbs. All of them require some initial investments. And there are incentives for that. There are incentives for purchase of these technologies, but they usually exclude households that maybe don't have a strong credit to get a loan, or do not pay taxes, or do not own their own houses, or maybe they don't live in a single family home. So I'll give you another example here. Let's take a closer look at solar panels. This semester, I actually had a team of students looking at net metering policies in the US. So net metering was created to spur behind the meter solar generation. It allows customers to get compensation for their excess generation that is fed to the grid. But as behind the meter generation rises, net metering policies need to evolve. So what happens is the rooftop solar customer, the person that actually had the money to invest on that technology, they have low electricity bill because now they are generating much of their electricity. So that means they are not covering enough of the costs that the utilities have to operate, maintain, and expand the grid. So what happens is, as behind the meter solar generation increase, the utilities will need to raise rates to recover their cost, and the system costs will eventually fall on other customers, those same customers that were not able to afford the solar panel in the first place. So this is just one example, but there are many other instances where we can see things like these happening. But even in the best case scenario, even if cost of energy does not rise, even if electricity rates do not rise, just increased temperatures, like Christina mentioned on her talk, they will mean hotter summers, heat waves, excessive heat days that will increase the amount of time people run their air conditioners, which in turn will also increase their energy bills. So the main takeaway I wanted you to get from this is climate change has the potential to aggravate energy justice concerns over time. So many people are aware of climate change. Many countries are already taking action to reduce emissions, but not much has been done to make sure that everyone is included in the transition. So as is the one thing I wanna say before I pass on is climate change and clean energy, they are not just about technology. We need to make sure that climate justice is also a priority. And I strongly believe that governance is the key to a just clean energy transition. And with that in mind, I want to say thank you again and hand the floor to my friend, Rafaela.
Thank you so much. Good evening. So I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you today about this very important topic. So it is truly an honor to be a part of this panel alongside Dr. Luna Lima and of course, Christina Martinez and Ricardo. So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us here today. And if you allow me, I'd like to jump right into a story. And that's my story. So imagine a young girl leaves Brazil heading for New York. It's the brutal winter of 1988 in the Northeast. And her small family is making its way to Somerville, one of Boston's many up and coming neighborhoods. On the streets, Portuguese and Brazilian children play together, and the sounds of Portuguese echo throughout the neighborhood. I was that little girl. We had made our way to America, but the neighborhood felt very segregated, which kept us immersed in the Brazilian. We could literally survive without having to speak English and received news updates from home. That was the same year that Chico Mendes, who fought tirelessly to preserve the Amazon rainforest and the rights of Brazilian peasants, was gunned down and assassinated. Sadly, I felt lucky to be away from the chaos. I mean, there was a lot of chaos brewing between the large companies, energy companies, politicians, environmentalists, you name it. Initially, I wasn't allowed into the English classes. As my parents explained, you don't speak good enough yet. I spent the next few years trying to sound like an American, dress like an American, and literally look like an American. So I tried so very, very hard to fit in. And I was 11 before I was allowed into an all-American English-speaking classroom. That was the year the United Nations Convention on Climate Change was established. And more regulations were being negotiated and signed during the Earth Summit in Rio to protect the environment. So as you can see, my formative years were sprinkled with the events that shaped current ideologies and the emissions data that we use today. So the proudest day of my young life was the first time I brought home an English-speaking friend from school. My parents treated all my American friends like royalty. They cooked anything they wanted, drove them anywhere, and soon enough, our house was the place to be. We had no boundary. We didn't know what those were. My friend will tell you, we welcomed everyone, Black, brown, white, anyone from anywhere and everywhere. So in 1997, I started my undergraduate studies in Boston, and I met my first serious boyfriend, an American guy. So conversations always started with, so how do you pronounce your name? Or which school did you go to? The best one was, oh yeah, you should meet our cleaning lady. She's from Brazil and she's very, very nice. So I was confused. I couldn't understand how I could still look different, sound different, and be different. So slowly I realized I did sound and look different. I would always be the Latin Brazilian girl. That same year, the Kyoto Protocol was signed and extended the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was based on the scientific consensus that global warming was occurring. But most importantly, that humans were driving it. The world's perception of the climate crisis and I were truly coming into our own pretty much at the same time. So my friends at Duke know that my academic journey led me to the United Nations. There, I realized everything I had done up to that point had something to do with protecting the environment, which naturally became my life's work, an inevitable calling. So during the last 3 administrations, I worked on social and environmental issues, including EPA's Clean Power Plan, which was later dismissed. I've traveled tirelessly around the world working at policy, the Paris Agreement, enforcing permits, and holding public consultations with displaced communities. I've given talks to environmental justice groups. I've swung the pendulum back and forth, preparing or responding to disasters. I've partnered with federal agencies, corporations, university. I even hosted little bitty clean energy fairs and helped teachers develop climate curriculums for public schools. So I've also formed leadership teams and youth opportunities for national and international groups to exchange scientific information. As difficult or impossible as it has been to simply fit in America, it was nothing compared to convincing people that climate change is an imminent threat in the Southeast, that it is real, or to convince them that the data shows temperatures have risen across the continuous 48 states since 1901 with an increased rate over the past 30 years. 8 of the top 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 1998. I used to highlight how scientists can prove the increase in greenhouse gases is man-made, but not anymore. Just as my understanding of myself as a Brazilian living in America must develop, I had to accept that human nature towards the environment would also evolve. It would adapt. Just like the desert plants adapt to unfriendly conditions, we will adapt our behavior, our physiological methods. We will cohabitate to survive. So I've decided to have faith in human nature. It's time to change our rhetoric into something positive, something that creates less conflict and disenfranchisement. This is especially important among marginalized communities like the Portuguese communities that I grew up with. We must engage them and enlist them as part of the solution. Moving forward, our conversation should be about opportunities, like Dr. Lima said, and also as Christina pointed out, that address inequalities, engaging youth and growing populations, creating new jobs, and adjusting to new technologies. So the views I share with you today are my own, and they do not represent my agency's current position on climate change. Unfortunately, I have seen firsthand that this is easier said than done, and oftentimes a divided, competitive, and politicized world. When I speak publicly on climate change, somebody always challenges me, and we can take down the slide there. I constantly hear the weather has always been changing. That's nothing new. Or flooding has always been happening. My personal favorite is when someone approaches me and says, "Oh, I'm so inspired by what you're doing. It's so philanthropic, protecting the environment. That's such a noble act. But charity work doesn't change the way the market works." Well, thank you. But I'm more interested in how the planet and how our society work to make the market work than how the market works on its own. When I started working on EPA's framework for coastal communities, a local watershed engineer said, "We simply can't address the causes and effect of climate change here in South Florida because we're so used to having multiple cars in our garages and our air conditioners running all the time. So we tackle our water issues separately than our air issues." I found out through my early work on the report, the local Latin community felt disenfranchised and left out, I mean, simply left out of local politics, just as I had felt growing up in a segregated corners of Boston. It seemed my family would soon feel the effects of climate change directly, not only professionally, but personally. I had begun sharing the updates that I was receiving and analyzing from EPA's inventory on US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks that was just up on that slide by economic sectors, which showed the drastic increase in temperatures over the last 30 years at a time when my daughter was in and out of the emergency room due to reactive respiratory issues. I too began to see the numbers behind the issues I was experiencing firsthand that others had already started to notice. So we all see how short-term and long-term changes in climate can affect Latin society in potentially disruptive ways. An obvious example is that warmer average temperatures could increase air conditioning costs, which could lead to what Dr. Lima alluded to, which is energy issues, energy injustice. It could also spread diseases and, of course, exacerbate respiratory conditions. Extreme variations in weather are a serious threat to Latin communities, like Christina mentioned, who tend to live along the coastline. As you'll note in the next infographic, in the United States, Latin populations are the highest in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and of course, Florida. More frequent and intense extreme heat events increase illnesses and deaths, especially among vulnerable Latin populations, in which, as the chart illustrates, no less than 25% are uninsured, often having to resort to the emergency room as their primary health insurance. Clearly, extreme heat damages crops, while increased precipitation can replenish water supplies and support agriculture. Intense storms damage property, cause loss of life and population displacement, temporarily disrupts essential services such as transportation, telecommunication, energy, and water supply, and the list goes on. So last year came the pandemic and changed how we perceive the world. It opened our eyes to what happens when a major crisis hits the entire world and showed how governments can and can't help. In 2017, 17% of this country's Latinx community felt insecure in their food supply. Since the pandemic, that number has risen to nearly 50%, absolutely unacceptable. A simple change in the weather will drastically continue to impact those families, and some simple changes in our ideology could save them. The pandemic brought many changes, as we know, and we are going through it today. Service professionals began suiting up and wearing masks. We started standing 6 feet apart while waiting in line. Many companies went virtual literally overnight. The world learned all kinds of new things. We had no choice but to adjust how we live our lives. All that energy focused on innovation and flexibility. We found creativity that we didn't think we had. Well, we had it all along. We can adjust our behavior quickly. My rhetoric is completely different than when we launched our climate change indicators. And if I could ask you to remember anything from today, it's not that sea level is rising, that glaciers are melting. It's that combating climate change is an opportunity to improve our food supply system, to protect our ecosystem, to innovate modes of transportation and healthcare, to create new jobs, to improve our diets, and revitalize our local economies. We can build equitably and more resilient communities. We can reassess building standards and become a conscientious generation with our future in mind. We must do these things. No matter what your point of view is, resilience is a life solution. ready to meet the aspirations of all Black and Brown Americans. This is not about winning or losing. So let's talk to see how the resilience of your communities can bring us together. For all my colleagues, friends, and family who celebrated my birthday and Earth Day with me last week, thank you. As you know, President Biden has challenged us. He's requesting a 52% reduction in carbon emissions in the 10 years. As he said, this is the decade. We must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis, and we can. We have seen firsthand through this pandemic how quickly we can change our behavior. Yes, the Latin community in the United States is vulnerable to the effects of climate change because of their geographic and socioeconomic status. Yes, the Latin community is a fast-growing population. And yes, we can make positive changes in our climate policies that will not only benefit all Latin Americans, but our nation and our planet as a whole. Together, we can make our environment, our planet, a healthy and inclusive home for all of us. So thank you for joining the battle today, for allowing me to speak to you and share my story. I'd especially like to thank Dr. Lima, Christina, our moderator, Ricardo, and Jessica and Kim for organizing this and bringing us together today. There's a lot of work ahead, and I hope this is just the beginning. So Ricardo, I'll hand things back to you.
Thank you very much, Rafaela. And trying to get my video back. And thank you to the three panelists. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Dr. Luana Lima. Amazing work, amazing experiences that you have shared with all of us, personal experiences, all the proximity that each one of you have had during these years of your life to climate change. We wanted to open the next few minutes for questions and answers. So I would ask the panelists, Luana, Christina, and Rafaela, to turn on the camera so people see you, and then they are probably more brave to start asking questions. One question while they gather their different questions that I wanted to hear from all of you was, we heard, great story from Rafael about what inspired her, and also from Christina, from her childhood, living, in Los Angeles and living close to fire. So definitely when somebody is so involved and so engaged with a topic like this, is because it's been, so close to their heart. And Luana expressed. Anything, Luana, else that you wanted to add about your personal experience and how this, has helped during your career for you to, focus so much on energy and the impact in climate change?
Yes, sure. As I mentioned, I didn't move to the US when I was a child as Rafaela. I actually came to the US in 2007 to study, to do my PhD. And then I went back to Brazil and ended up coming back to the US afterwards. But growing up, I lived in a city close to a river. We had this big river crossing the city. And I remember like floods all the time and the intensity of them growing. And the thing is, a lot of that is infrastructure problem. We have a lot of infrastructure deficits in Brazil and other countries in Latin America. So I can't blame those floods on climate change, but I remember the feeling. So the feeling of seeing like the water rise and worrying about your house and seeing all those people like being displaced from their homes. So that was one thing I remember growing up. And the other thing is when I started studying, my background is electrical engineering. So that's how I got involved in the energy side, more like started as the electricity part, and then energy as a whole. But working on that, looking at those effects on our hydropower plants was something that called my attention. Like, this is really happening. I look at future projections, but it's happening already. We can, if you look at historical data from these hydropower plants, you see that the inflow patterns are changing, the amount of electricity we're getting from these hydropower plants are changing. And there's a lot of need for new technology and new research. And one of the things that I wanted to do was, like, since I was exposed to that data that showed me a reality that, like Rafaela sometimes tell people, they don't believe us. I saw the data all my life. I've been working with data, and the data kind of showed me something that I already believe it, but I was able to prove. And then I decided that I wanted to, like, spread that with more people and educate future climate leaders. And that's what I do with my teaching. Like, at Duke, I teach a lot of students that are concerned with the environment. So I share with them my experience, and hopefully they will be the people that will take over this challenge and actually make things happen in the future, not just like promises and things that we are seeing right now. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's some things that will take a while. So that's why I felt like dedicating my experience and my knowledge of climate change to educating new climate leaders was my way of doing my part and doing something to society.
Thank you very much, Luana. Thank you very much for sharing that. I had a question for Christina, and that wanted to ask, as an individual, to people that are joining us today, what would be one thing or two things that people could do personally to help, reduce the greenhouse gases and improve our current situation? If each one could contribute to our current situation, what would you suggest, Christina?
No, yes, it's a great question. At least what I share with visitors, because they do ask these questions, like, what can I do individually on an individual level? At least when we look at, I think diet is a huge component of that. And, considering that, like, cows and red meat do contribute a lot of good portion of greenhouse gases, especially methane, when it comes to, like, tending of cows. So I do tell visitors, maybe reducing the amount of meat or a lot of these intensive animal products that require a lot of energy, not just meat, but also one thing that, I do tell visitors, like almonds. Almonds are a very water intensive crop. They do require a lot of water, a lot of energy. So I know as we are, heading into more plant-based diets, also considering, well, even with some of these plant-based options, which ones have less of an energy demand. Also I do tell visitors, think about how much it took for, the food on your plate to travel, the emissions associated with not only maybe feeding those animals, the process of transporting that food, and also just thinking overall, like the carbon footprint on your dinner plate. So I think on the individual level, that is something that I do share with visitors. And another thing too, that, obviously with a pandemic has gotten a lot more challenging. And in some cities, it's easier to do in others, but using public transportation to reduce the amount of times that you're using your own personal vehicle. But of course, that is not something that a lot of communities can do, especially if you don't have reliable public transportation. With, Los Angeles, unfortunately, is a city that doesn't have reliable public transit. A lot of people do rely on vehicles. But that's when, urban planning comes into place to make cities are a little bit more friendly for public transportation. So those are kind of like the first two that come into my head on an individual level, because there's definitely, things that as a collective people can do as well.
Excellent, Christina. Thank you very much for sharing. And those are things that each one of us can do. And we can all contribute a little bit to continue to improve. I had a question for Rafaela. Some people are here for a reason. They want to learn more about climate change. They want to contribute. If someone, Rafaela, wanted to start doing their own research and want to get more involved in climate, struggle and situation, what would you suggest for them to do? Where can they go to learn more about climate change?
Great question, Ricardo. So I would, say start at Duke. Start with the Duke School, because I think Duke has been an incredible place to experiment. I think the staff is knowledgeable and they put forward a lot of innovative materials. They're so well positioned geographically. So I highly recommend, of course, with the universities being a starting point. But if you don't want to make this an academic journey or a career, or if you just want, just to get some sort of idea, or just for the plain citizen that doesn't want to make a big thing of this, like they just want to be a little familiar with what's happening, I would recommend, as an advisor, I was an advisor for the project Drawdown, and I highly recommend starting there as a very simple place to go, because they did a fantastic job. It took a lot of work, a lot of research, but they were able to compile all the solutions that are available and rank them. And I think that was a really eye-opening experience for me to see that. And to be part of that project, I realized things that I thought were the solutions weren't necessarily the best solution, the most economical solution, or the ones that emit less for less money. So, these are all things that they considered when they put this project together and ranked those solutions. So, one of the things that which was a surprise to me, was that on the top 10 rankings, that educating girls and women was one of the top 10, and plant-rich diets, things that we don't really consider, like refrigerant management, things that we don't consider on our everyday life when we talk about climate change, is worth looking into a little bit more, just for information and knowledge, to see how accessible the solutions are to us. And sometimes people don't realize that.
Thank you, Rafaela. Thank you very much. There's a couple of terms that I heard when we were discussing this: climate justice, environmental racism. Luana, could you expand on any of these terms, like climate justice and environmental racism, please?
Yeah, when I mentioned climate justice, I was referring at the fact that climate change affects communities and countries in different ways. And sometimes countries that are not emitting as much CO2, they're actually the ones that's suffering more the effect of it. And also the fact that the energy transition is not accessible to everybody, and everybody should be able to be part of these. So that's what I meant by climate justice. Maybe there's other understanding for that. I don't know if Rafaela and Christina agree with me, but that's how I see it.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. There's a couple questions. We have a couple of minutes. There's one about Latinx countries. This is from Tio Zavaria. Are Latinx countries more or less motivated to take action on climate change? With COVID, we have seen countries across the world having to take focused action to combat a problem. Does this at all influence Latin American countries to be more proactive on climate change? And Christina, could you elaborate a little bit on that, or please? Your thoughts on, if Latin American countries, you think they would be more motivated to take action on climate change?
I think somebody like Luana or Rafaela will be a little bit more appropriate for this question.
Perfect. Rafaela, do you want to elaborate on this one about Latinx countries? The role in climate change?
It's a little bit outside of my national scope because I focus on the United States primarily when I work with climate policies and climate policy implementation. So I would defer this to Dr. Lima. since she is a little bit more international in her scope and her research?
Yeah, sure. I can
Sure.
I can try to answer that. I really feel like they are more motivated just because they are already living those effects. There's the problem of accessibility. Sometimes they cannot invest on power panels, solar power panels, for example, because there's no incentive from the government like we have here in the US. So I'm talking about Brazil now, just thinking back, like we have a lot of utility scale solar coming up, but I don't see a lot of residential solar yet because of the lack of the of credits and incentives like we have here in the US. But I do see other things, like, for example, one thing that's very common in Brazil is like solar panels, but for water heating, not for electricity itself. So there are other measures, other technologies that are popular in Latin America and in Brazil. For example, a lot of our transportation, our car fleet, they can run on ethanol instead of oil. So that's another aspect of how we are already using some renewable energy on our energy sector. So yeah, that's the first thing that came to my mind when I saw the questions.
Thank you, Luana. Appreciate it. Let's see, one question focused on COVID-19 and if you think that COVID-19 has allowed us to definitely demonstrate that climate change is a human-made condition. Do you think that because of the current situation, people are more aware of these type of things and that they're human-made condition? Maybe for you, Rafaela?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think that we are just becoming more conscientious of what our behavior is and how quickly things can change if we're not conscientious and if we're not prepared for something. So we could prepare and we can be resilient, but there will be unexpected things, and that is what like some people feel when they feel a natural disaster. If they're not prepared and it comes to them unexpectedly, it really opens their eyes. And I think that the pandemic opened our eyes in a lot of ways. I think that we can see, our behaviors changing. We can see things that we were feeling that we knew was already happening, but then it actually got exacerbated by the pandemic. So I think that puts a lot in front of us to consider. And I also feel that we have to reflect. So we're still going through it. So I think that it allows us to reflect. It allows us to look at each other and to see the consequences of our behavior, not just us individuals, but our communities, our society, our stakeholders, our leaders, what they do and how that impacts us, and how they fail us sometimes, and how we may sometimes have to prepare for ourselves. So I think that, it opened our eyes, and it's a moment of reflection for everybody, I think.
Thank you very much, Rafaela. With this question, I know that everybody wants to ask more questions. I wanted to ask another one to Christina, but we're running out of time, and in respect to all of you, for respect to our panelists, I wanted to thank everybody for being here with us. We hope that this was as informative for you as it was for me. Thank you very much, Rafaela. Thank you, Dr. Luna, and thank you very much, Christina. Please, we invite you to join us for our next event. It is on May 4th, where DUHLAA is co-sponsoring a very important event, Asian Voices Through the Decades. I also want to thank Jessica and Kim behind the scenes, and Jennifer Moreno, who was responsible for organizing and putting together this event. Thank you very much. Good night. Pleasure being with you.